The cough comes first, dry, aching, innocent, then the fever, the stillness, the look in your mother's eyes, as she draws a cross above the hearth to keep the spirits out. You lie on a bed, stuffed with straw and laced with rosemary, listening to bells toll down muddy streets. Outside, men carry bundles of herbs, muttering prayers and curses. Inside, your grandmother burns a toad in the fire. For your soul, she says. It is not the illness that scares you most. It is the cure. And as smoke curls into the rafters and the shadows grow long, you wonder, is this sickness inside you? Or is it something that was invited? If these ancient fears haunt your thoughts or awaken old wonder, tell me, could you have trusted the hands that claim to heal you? Like, share, and drift deeper with us. Audience engagement question. What's the strangest old medical belief you've ever heard of, or feared might still be true? The bell tolled low and slow, dragging its sound across the damp air like a rusted chain over stone. You were 6 years old the first time you heard it, not from the church tower, but from your mother's mouth, whispered into your hair as she held you beneath the flickering shadow of an iron cross. Another soul lost to pride, she said, as if pride had hands that could strangle a man in his sleep. In this world, sickness was not something you caught. It was something you invited, something you deserved. A cough was not a symptom, it was a stain. A fever, not an affliction, but a reckoning. And as the cold wrapped itself around your ankles, and the wax of the prayer candle wept down its length, you began to understand. Every illness had a meaning, and every suffering, a cause. If this chapter stirs a memory of old fears, or awakens wonder at the strange paths behind us, consider subscribing or sharing this journey. What part of this ancient belief still echoes in us today? The chapel was dark and close, its stone walls sweating beneath old tapestries that had long stopped offering warmth. Your mother knelt beside you on the straw-strewn floor, her voice rising and falling like waves against the shore of your thoughts. She prayed in Latin, a language you did not yet understand, though you knew its tone. It was not a plea, it was an apology. Outside, a cart creaked past, its wheels biting the cobbled road with every turn. You did not need to look, you knew what it carried. A white sheet, a stillness beneath it, a stain at its corner where the soul had not quite dried, and with it, the murmured judgment of the neighbors. He had coveted, they said, or gambled, or touched a woman too freely. What else could explain the sores? Your father sat near the altar, hands trembling despite the shawl your sister had woven for him. Each convulsion was quiet, but no less shameful. His sickness had not passed with the last winter. Some said it was justice, others said it was madness. You only knew that when he shook, your mother closed her eyes longer than usual, and your brother stepped back just slightly from his chair. In this small village, tucked between forest and frost, disease was not random, it was precise. It chose the angry, the greedy, the lustful. At least, that is what the sermon said. Sin rotted the soul, and where the soul rotted, the body followed. Pustules for envy, tremors for wrath, tumors for deceit. The priests kept no medical books, only the scriptures, and in them, the root of every ailment was found not in the soil, but in the heart. When the midwife's youngest began to cough, the congregation turned toward her with narrowed eyes. She had once refused to baptize her baby until the 7th day. Some whispered that was enough. Enough to make heaven hesitate. Enough to let something else slip in instead. And so her child coughed, and coughed, and coughed, until one morning the crib was silent. There were no physicians in your town, only priests, and sometimes only one priest, an old man with a spine like a hooked branch and eyes that seemed too tired to judge, but did so anyway. His prescriptions were always the same: confession, flagellation, fasting. Wash not your wounds, but your conscience. Starve the sin, cleanse the vessel, purify the breath with incense and shame. You remembered the time a boy from the next village over came, desperate. His sister had a fever that painted her face red and robbed her voice. The priest did not touch her. He placed a black cloth over her face and spoke 3 words. You did not understand. Later you learned it was a rite for the dead, given before the breath was gone. She passed that night, not because of what he did, but because of what he didn't. The townspeople praised his decision. Better to release her soul, they said, than let the sin spread, and spread it did. The baker's wife next, then a stable boy, then your neighbor's husband. Each taken not by bacteria or virus, words you had never heard, but by their hidden transgressions, or so everyone believed. Sickness was a mirror, and it never lied. You came to dread your own body. A sneeze brought not comfort, but a creeping guilt. Was it the lie you told your mother about the missing herbs, the broken rosary you did not confess to breaking? A scratch in your throat could only mean one thing, that you had done something to deserve it. At night, your mother boiled water and hung sprigs of rosemary over the door, not to cleanse the air, but to ward off demons. Sin, after all, had many forms. Some walked on two legs. Some flew through windows like smoke. She whispered prayers into the corners of the house, as if illness had ears and could be reasoned with. And sometimes, in the darkness, you wondered if it did. There were stories of the north, where healers spoke not of sin but of imbalance, where they did not fear the soul's corruption, but the body's cold and heat, its wetness and dryness. Foreign ways, the priest called them. Heresy in bandage form. But a part of you wondered if those people suffered less, or merely sinned differently. As the chapel emptied and your father remained slumped in the pew, your mother pressed a hand to his forehead. She did not cry. Her prayers had become as quiet and thin as breath on glass. And in that still moment between her silence and his trembling you felt something shift inside you. Not belief, not doubt, but a question. What if the fever was not a punishment? What if it was just a fire, trying to protect you? The bell tolled again. Somewhere, another soul had been judged. You pulled your cloak tighter, not against the cold, but against the eyes. The room smells of iron. Not the kind found in a blacksmith's forge, but something wetter, saltier. It clings to the back of your throat, settling there like memory. You sit on a wooden bench, trembling not from cold, but from what you've been told is about to be done. Your wrist is bare, exposed, and before you, the barber sharpens his blade. Outside, the wind howls low, dragging a curtain of mist through the alley. But inside, the world is warmer. Too warm, in fact. The fire in the hearth burns bright. Not for comfort, but to keep the tools hot. There are no white coats here, no instruments of gleaming silver, only a base, a strip of cloth, and a man whose profession includes haircuts and healing. He smiles at you, thin-lipped and practiced. Too much blood, he says. That's all it is. You nod, though you do not understand. But you trust him. Because everyone trusts him. Because the body, they say, is a vessel. And vessels must be balanced. Blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile. 4 humours, like 4 winds steering the ship of your flesh. When one grows too strong, the ship lists, staggers, sinks. Illness is not an invader. It is a spill. You are 13. You have not yet kissed a girl. But already your blood is seen as dangerous. The nosebleeds, the flush in your cheeks, the ache behind your eyes when you lie awake at night. Too much heat, they told you. Too much passion. Too much red. And so, the blade. The barber lifts your arm, his hands calloused and firm. He does not ask permission. It has already been given by your mother, by the church, by the old scrolls written in a time when men believed. Fluids shaped the soul. The cut is shallow. You barely feel it. What you do feel is the warmth. A sudden rush of liquid down your forearm, tickling, pooling, dripping. Into the bowl it falls, rhythmically, like a clock counting backward. Each drop a hope, each drop a prayer. Around you, the walls are cluttered with jars, leeches floating lazily, waiting for their next meal. Shelves of dried herbs, cracked salves, and stained linens hang like forgotten ghosts. A faint moaning comes from behind the curtain. Someone else is being balanced. You try not to look. The barber hums softly as he works, his eyes half-lidded. He is not a cruel man, only a practical one. His father bled patients before him, as did his grandfather. They bled kings, queens, paupers, priests. It was the great equalizer, the belief that inside every person flowed the same red tide, capable of both nourishing and drowning. You wonder how many bowls he fills in a day. He speaks of the 4 humours like old friends. Blood is hot and wet, like spring. Phlegm is cold and wet, like winter. Yellow bile is hot and dry, the fire of summer. And black bile is autumn, cold, dry, heavy. He He tells you your bile is likely out of sorts, that your dreams, the strange ones with shadowy hands and flickering lights, are signs that your stomachache last week, melancholia, building like smoke in a sealed room. You nod again, though none of it makes sense. He wraps your arm in linen once the bowl is half full, and holds it up to the light like wine. Better already, he murmurs, almost to himself. You are light-headed. The room spins, but you smile, because he smiles. And when you leave, stepping into the grey slush of the street, your mother presses her hand to your cheek and sighs in relief. Pale again, she says. Thank God. In the weeks to come, you'll return twice more. Each time, the same ritual, the same scent, the same iron-tasting silence. You'll be told your blood is thick with anger, or grief, or too many dreams. You'll drink broths laced with ash and powdered chalk. You'll rest beneath blankets that smell of old herbs and wait for balance to return. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it doesn't. One morning, a man you know, the cooper's brother, is found pale and still. He had been bleeding for days. For his fever, they said. For his rudeness. For his sin. He bled until there was nothing left to balance. The barber attends his burial, standing at the edge of the field with stained hands tucked behind his back. No one blames him. They blamed the humour. In time, you begin to speak of your own body and elements. You do not say you are tired. You say your phlegm is sluggish. You do not say you are frightened. You say your blood is rising. Your very self is reduced to a recipe, and every emotion an ingredient. You overhear the priest once, whispering to a dying man. Your melancholy consumed you, he said. Confess now, before it claims your soul. The man wept. Not for the sin, but for the bile. It is strange, looking back, how firmly they believed in fluids and balance, in bleeding and boiling and purging with bitter herbs. But at the time, it was all you knew. It made sense in the way that fire makes sense when it chases away the cold. Crude, maybe, but honest. And sometimes, when the fever broke, it even worked. Or maybe, you just healed in spite of it. In the end, it didn't matter. The bowl had been filled, the blood had been spilled, and the balance, for now, restored. The fever returned in the middle of the night. First as a flush across your chest, then as a tremble in your limbs, and finally as a tightness behind your eyes, like something unseen pressing inward, gently but without end. You woke in sweat, your blanket kicked off, mouth dry as parchment. The hearth had long since gone out, but your skin burned. Your grandmother lit a taper from the embers and shuffled towards your cot, her nightgown trailing like a ghost behind her. She touched your brow, frowned, then muttered a word in the old tongue, the one your mother said you shouldn't repeat. She didn't reach for water, she didn't send for the priest. She reached for the toad. It lived in a lidded basket by the hearth, wrapped in moss and dried leaves. You had seen it once, its eyes blinking slowly like something that had seen too much. It did not croak, it did not resist, as if it knew it had a role to play in this long, strange tradition. She turned to you, her breath heavy with fennel and clove, and whispered, "It will draw out the poison." You were too weak to protest. She placed the toad beneath your bed, muttering as she did, sprinkling ash in a circle around the cot, and tying a charm of nettle and sage to the beam above your head. You watched from the edge of sleep as her shadow danced across the wall, long and twitching, like an ancient creature reborn in candlelight. When dawn came, the toad was dead. Your grandmother lifted it with a cloth, nodded solemnly, and buried it in the frost-hardened garden beneath the withered rue. Took the sickness with it, she said. Good toads always do. But still, you ate. That morning, the village healer was summoned. A man with skin like bark and eyes the colour of rain. He carried no satchel of herbs, no instruments of brass, only a pouch filled with bones, bread and mouse fur. He smelled of smoke and damp earth, as if he lived half below the soil. He knelt beside you and stared, unblinking. Then he reached into his pouch and withdrew a dead mouse, stiff and cold. With thin leather twine, he tied it to your wrist, and instructed your mother not to remove it until the moon had waned. It will feed on the sickness, he said. That night, you dreamed of water. Not clear water, but murky, slow water, thick with reeds and hidden teeth. You walked through it, hip deep, searching for something, a name, a voice, a cure. When you woke, the mouse was gone. Only the twine remained, empty and damp. Your fever had not broken. The healer returned with a fresh plan. Bread, thick, old and coarse, pressed against your chest until it warmed with your skin. Then he took it and tossed it to the dog waiting outside. You watched with hollow eyes as the dog sniffed the bread, hesitated, then walked away. The healer's face turned pale. "She's nearly gone," he whispered. Your mother began to cry. And so came the next cure. 7 black stones placed beneath your mattress, arranged like the stars in Orion's belt. A small silver bell hung above your door. Rosemary was burned at the window. And every night, your grandmother whispered charms to keep the witches away. Sometimes she whispered to your illness as if it were a guest, unwelcome, but powerful. She asked it to leave kindly, offered it milk, sang it lullabies. You wondered, as the weeks blurred, if the sickness was still inside you, or if it had slipped into the walls. Watch. One evening, as the sun sank in streaks of orange and pewter, you caught sight of your brother digging in the garden. Your name had been written on a piece of parchment and burned. Your hair, cut without your knowing, was buried in the roots of the old tree near the stream. Protection, they said, but from what? There was never one answer. Some blamed the wind, others a curse. A passing stranger with eyes too pale. The goat that birthed twins. The song you hummed backwards. Your left-handedness. The missing nail from the barn door. The toad. The bread. The dog. The mouse. Everything could be a cause. Everything could be a cure. And so, you began to feel less like a person and more like a battleground. Each charm another soldier. Each ritual a siege. Your body a fortress occupied by something no one could name, and everyone feared. But you remembered the toad's eyes. And sometimes, late at night, you swore you could feel something watching from beneath your bed, waiting to be needed again. It began with a girl. She was young, no older than 15, with hair like wheat before harvest, and a laugh that once sounded like spring. You had seen her in the square many times, fetching bread, brushing snow from her shawl, tying ribbons to the church gate during feast days. She was kind, unremarkable, familiar, and then one morning, she danced. Not the way one does in joy, with rhythm and grace, but in a feverish frenzy, arms flailing, feet stamping, her body moving with no music, no thought, as if strings had been tied to her limbs and pulled by something no one could see. At first people watched, then they gathered, then they whispered. Within the hour, others had joined her. A boy, then an old man, then 2 women from the apothecary's row. They writhed together in the square, twisting, stomping, eyes wide and mouths slack. Some screamed, others wept. One laughed so hard he choked. You stood at the edge, clutching your mother's hand, heart pounding like a drum you could not escape. They danced until dusk. Blood seeped from their heels. One woman's ankle twisted grotesquely beneath her, and still she moved. A man bit through his tongue. The cobbles turned slick with sweat, spit and something deeper. Some say it was possession, others mass hysteria. In those days they called it a curse, or a punishment, or a test. The priest declared a vigil. The town gathered in the chapel that night, candles trembling in every hand. Children slept across pews. Mothers murmured prayers with cracked lips. Men sat silently, sharpening blades for reasons they could not name. The girl, the first one, lay in the nave, bound in linen, eyes rolling beneath heavy lids. She saw the devil, someone whispered. He kissed her hands and made her his puppet. Your grandmother said otherwise. It's in the air, she told you, like madness, or pollen. Once breathed, it never leaves, and you had breathed it. The next morning, the dancing resumed. This time, in the fields. The afflicted leapt among the rye, tore at their garments, screamed names that did not belong to them. Some cried for mothers long dead, others sang hymns backward. A boy ran straight into the river and did not surface. You felt something in your own legs that day. A twitch, a tremble. Was it real? Or the echo of fear? You gripped the doorway and held your breath, willing your limbs to remain still. The townsfolk tried everything. Drummers were brought in to match the rhythm, to tire the dancers until they collapsed. Wine was poured down their throats. Bread was rubbed against their skin and fed to goats. One girl was locked in a root cellar for 2 days when she emerged. Her hair had turned white. A new theory emerged. It was not sin, it was not spirits, it was music. And so the church summoned musicians. A fiddle, a pipe, a dulcimer with half its strings. They played somber tunes in the square, hoping to guide the madness. And for a while it seemed to work. The dancers slowed, their steps grew measured, the flailing became twirls, the shrieks humming. But then the music stopped, and the frenzy returned tenfold. You remember one woman, barefoot and bleeding, lifting her arms as if welcoming the sun, though it was midnight. "He's inside me," she said, "and he's laughing." That night, a decision was made. The afflicted were to be cleansed, not with prayer, not with charm, but with cold. Buckets were filled from the well, a trough dragged to the riverbank. Each dancer was plunged into the freezing water, held down until their writhing stilled. Some gasped and sobbed, others did not rise. You watched from a hill, wrapped in 3 cloaks and 2 prayers. The wind bit your cheeks, your eyes stung, but you did not look away. Afterward, silence fell, a deep, uneasy hush that pressed on the village like snow on a roof. The priest proclaimed it over, the curse lifted, Saint Vitus appeased, but no one danced at the next feast. No one sang. The square remained empty, and when the girl, the first one, passed you weeks later, she did not smile. Her eyes were blank, her mouth too still. She walked as if pulled by strings still attached. You never knew what truly happened. Was it possession? Poison? A sickness of the mind, of the air, of the soul? All you knew was that something ancient had moved through your village, through bodies and breath and fear, and for a brief moment, the line between affliction and rhythm had vanished. Even now, when music plays, part of you listens too closely, and your legs, sometimes, still twitch. You hear them before you see them, the rustling of heavy fabric, the dull thud of a cane against stone, the hollow rasp of breath, echoing behind curved glass. When the plague returns, it never knocks. It seeps. It settles in doorways and hearths, in silence and in sweat. And when it comes, so do they. The plague doctors. You are 10 when he arrives in your village, mounted on a black horse too thin for its own shadow. His robe is long, waxed and dark, stiff like bark, streaked with mud and something darker. But it is the mask that freezes your breath. A long beak, curved like a heron's, filled with herbs and vinegar-soaked cloth. His eyes are hidden behind round glass, tinted and soulless. He looks less like a man and more like a creature from a dream you were never meant to remember. Children hide. Mothers cross themselves. The priest steps back into his chapel and closes the door. The doctor says nothing. He never does. He moves slowly, deliberately, as if every step must be measured. He does not touch the sick. He observes, taps the floor with his cane, scribbles something onto parchment, tucks it away, moves on. When he comes to your street, doors close in sequence like a row of fallen dominoes. Your own family stays inside. The air is thick with rosemary and the acrid smoke of burning rags. A bundle of lavender hangs over the window, tied in silk. Your grandmother insists on it, says the plague fears perfume. You watch the doctor from the crack in the shutter. He pauses outside the blacksmith's house. 2 children were coughing there last week. Their mother hasn't been seen since the morning market. He raises a hand, gloved in thick leather, and marks the door with white chalk. A single X. It's not a death sentence. Not officially. But everyone knows what follows. By evening, no candles burn in the blacksmith's window. The theory of bad air is all you've known. Miasma, they call it. The sickness rides on wind, in rot, in breath. You've been told not to open the shutters, not to hang laundry after dusk. Don't burn meat. Don't let water stand still in bowls. Keep your feet warm and your fears cooler. The doctor's mask is said to protect him, not from curses or demons, but from the air itself. The herbs stuffed in the beak, mint, rose petals, wormwood, camphor, a garden of hope pressed into a beak of dread. He breathes through flowers so he will not breathe in death. But you wonder, does it help? You've heard stories. Some say the doctors fall sick like anyone else. Others say they vanish, their names lost, their papers burned. One woman claims they're not doctors at all. only spirits summoned by cities to witness suffering and carry it away. When your uncle begins to cough, you don't tell anyone. Not at first. You press garlic to his chest and rub his feet with oil. He says nothing, only stares at the wall and murmurs names you've never heard. But when the coughing deepens, wet and sharp, your father takes action. The doctor is summoned. He arrives at dusk, coat glistening with drizzle. Your uncle lies on the floor, wrapped in linen, his face ashen, lips cracked. The doctor kneels beside him, cane tapping once against the floor. No words, just a long exhale through his beak, like wind through hollow bone. He checks nothing, measures nothing. Instead, he opens a small pouch, pulls out a dried orange stuffed with cloves, and places it near your uncle's face. Then he rises, marks the door. A single X. Your father asks what more can be done. The doctor does not answer, just walks away. The next morning, your uncle is gone, buried before sunrise, with no rites, no procession. The ground is still damp from the night's rain. The chalk mark remains for weeks. You begin to notice the signs of the sickness everywhere. In smells, in colours, in silence. A neighbour no longer leaves bread on her sill. A dog howls all night outside an empty home. The cobbler's window cracks and is never mended. And always, the doctor moves like a shadow with purpose. Invisible but never absent. Children begin to draw his shape in the dirt. Long robes, stick legs, a beak. Some call him Birdman. Others refuse to speak of him at all. You dream of him once, standing in your doorway, breathing slow and deep, flowers falling from his mask, like ash. Your grandmother insists you carry cloves in your pocket. Your mother leaves bowls of vinegar near every window. Your father sharpens the sickle, though no one speaks of the harvest. Eventually, the sickness wanes. Not all are gone, but enough are buried. The silence deepens, and just like that, the doctor vanishes. No farewell, no word. Only the X marks remain, fading slowly in the rain. For years afterward you'll wonder what he saw behind his mask. Whether he felt pity, or fear, or nothing at all. Whether he believed the herbs helped, or simply kept the stench at bay. You'll carry that image forever. The long-beaked mask, the cane, the silence. And whenever illness returns, part of you will still expect to hear it. The slow rustle of robes, the hiss of breath through lavender, the tap, tap, tap on cobblestone. The spoon trembles in your hand. A thick syrup clings to its edge, dark and glistening, like molasses laced with coal dust. Your mother urges you to drink, her voice soft but sharp around the edges, the kind of voice used when something must be done, even if it cannot be explained. All the way, she says. It will drive it out. You tip the spoon past your lips. The taste is immediate, sickly sweet at first, then sharp, metallic, bitter. Your stomach recoils. You gag, but she cups your chin and coaxes it down. Honey and wool, she whispers, with a dusting of emerald, burnt just right. You do not ask where she found the emerald, or why burnt wool is in your medicine. In this village, in this time, the line between cure and punishment is not always clear. Your fever had risen through the night, and now you lie on the pallet by the fire, watching the smoke twist like slow snakes in the rafters. Someone muttered that your soul was too tasty, and illness had crept in to feed. So your mother turned to the healer. Not the priest this time, nor the barber surgeon, but the woman who lived near the mill, with a cupboard full of powders and promises. She arrived at dawn, smelling of vinegar and violets, wrapped in shawls that jingled with bone charms. Her fingers were stained, green at the tips, black beneath the nails. She carried no books, only vials. No cross, only a ring of dried thistle strung through her braid. Your mother offered her coin, but the healer waved it away. "I'll take what works," she said, and took your old shoes instead. She knelt beside you, peered into your mouth, pressed your chest with 3 fingertips, then smiled. "A bitter heat," she said. "It wants out." Then came the recipe. Honey, burnt wool, crushed emerald, a pinch of lye, 3 drops of vinegar that had been steeped with rose petals and iron nails, a hair from a black dog, stirred with a knife that had once drawn blood in war, boiled until the steam turned blue. The concoction shimmered strangely when poured. Your mother trusted her. She always had. The woman had helped during the last birthing, and again when the butcher's wife coughed up bile for 3 nights. You remembered that. The small pouch of deer droppings tied to her ankle. The way she'd fed the woman a mixture of ash and milk. She recovered. Or maybe the fever simply fled, but the healer was praised. And her fame grew like mold on wet bread. You shift beneath your blanket now, the taste of the medicine still coating your tongue. Your skin tingles. Your head feels both heavy and floating. The healer watches from the corner, muttering softly into a strip of cloth she ties to your wrist. Let it out, she says. In wealthier towns, you've heard, the rich are given powdered pearls, or powdered mummies, shipped from faraway sands, crumbled into wine and swallowed in silence. You've heard of noble women placing crushed rubies on their tongues to cool the blood, of dukes bathing in goat's milk, steeped in thistle and crushed lice. One lord, they say, paid to have the fat of a hanged man smeared on his chest to banish lung rot. Your medicine, at least, is local. Still, not all cures come in spoons or salves. There's the neighbour who sits in smoke thrice a day, convinced the scent of singed sage and horsehair chases death from her lungs. There's the farmer who drinks cider with wormwood every dusk to sour the spirits before they sour me, he says. The woman 3 houses down swears by pigeon's blood. Applied, not swallowed. She slaughters one each week and paints her chest with it as if drawing out some shadow beneath her ribs. You once saw a child buried up to his neck in dung, grinning through cracked lips as his mother explained it was to sweat the fever away. The flies did not care if it worked. No one speaks of these things with doubt, only reverence. And so, when your mother rubs your chest with lard mixed with burnt onion, you lie still. When she slips a fragment of bone beneath your pillow, you say nothing. When the healer crushes a wasp nest into your porridge and calls it strength, you eat, even as your throat tightens and your eyes well with tears. Days pass. The fever rises, falls, returns. Your dreams are strange now. You see colours that don't exist. Hear whispers from beneath the floor. Feel your own breath curling backward inside your chest. The healer nods when you describe it. That means it's listening, she says. That means it's leaving. But you're not sure which it she means, the illness or the cure. Then, one morning, your body is still. No fever, no tremble. Only silence. Your mother weeps and thanks the herbs, the honey, the wool, the emerald. The healer accepts a silver hairpin and leaves without a word. You do not know whether the sickness truly left, or simply grew tired of the war. You only know you are empty now, and the taste of burnt wool still lingers. The cage stood in the orchard, half swallowed by grass. Its bars rusted and damp with morning mist. It creaked when the wind shifted. A sound like a groan too old to bother crying out. Inside it sat a man, or what once had been one. His limbs were thin as twigs, his skin blotched with lesions that cracked and oozed with each movement. He wore only a thin linen shift stained by time and weather, and spoke to the birds. You first saw him when you were sent to gather apples. The tree nearest the cage bore fruit small and bitter, but your mother insisted it kept longest. You approached with caution, heart thudding, the hem of your tunic wet with dew. The man watched you with eyes too large for his gaunt face, then grinned, wide, yellow, empty. "Have you come to laugh?" he asked. You said nothing. He raised a shaking hand and pointed to the sky. "The birds don't laugh. They only sing. That's why they're still free." You turned and ran, the basket forgotten in the grass. That night, over a dinner of turnip stew, your mother explained. "He's mad," she said, touched by the sickness and left with nothing behind. She spooned broth into your bowl and sighed. It was either the cage or the pit. The pit, you knew, was where they buried the others. The ones who didn't stop coughing, the ones who forgot their own names, the ones who screamed at shadows and flinched at bells. Some believed the madness came after the fever, like a second storm. Others said it was the disease itself, burrowing deeper than the flesh. But there were other whispers. That laughter could be dangerous. That too much joy opened the door to madness. That if you let your mind stretch too far, it might never return. The man had been a stonemason once, with a wife and 2 sons. Then he took ill. The fever burned through him. And when it left, it took everything. He began to hum, even as his skin broke out in sores. He laughed at funeral. He spun in circles in the marketplace, calling the names of flowers no one had ever heard. The village feared him more than they feared death. And so, they built the cage, not as punishment, as prevention. You returned days later, drawn by something you couldn't name. He sat cross-legged, humming a tune with no rhythm, no key. Around him, the grass grew high. No one dared cut it. The birds still came. They perched on the cage, near his hands, near his feet. He never touched them, only spoke to them in riddles. "You're not sick," you said finally. He turned to you slowly. "Aren't I?" His voice was soft, frayed. "Tell me, do the sick know they're sick?" You didn't answer. He smiled again, but it faded quickly. "They put me here to stop the laughter," he whispered. "They think it's catching, like the plague." You asked if it was. He shrugged. "Does it matter?" They were afraid. That's always enough. That night, you asked your grandmother whether madness could be cured. She stared into the fire for a long time before speaking. "Only if it wants to be," she said, "and only if it remembers who it was before." The man in the cage remembered everything. His wife's name, the stones he carved, the prayers he used to say, but he no longer believed in order, or structure, or rules. He said they were walls, and he had already lived behind too many. Sometimes the children dared each other to run past the cage. Some threw stones, others called him names. But he never cursed them. He only sang louder, lifting his cracked voice to the orchard sky. You came to sit near him just beyond reach. He told you stories not always coherent but always vivid, of rivers that healed, of creatures that lived in music, of sicknesses that whispered and cures that listened. "There's more to health than blood and bone," he'd say. "Sometimes it's the stories we carry." You believed him. And yet, you still kept your distance. One day, the cage was empty. No one spoke of it. No one saw him leave. Some said he died in the night, his body carried away by birds. Others whispered he had been taken to another village, or perhaps simply vanished, like mist, when the sun rises. But you noticed the grass stayed tall, where he once sat, and the tree nearest the cage, the one with bitter fruit, began to bloom brighter than the rest. In the years that followed, you thought often of him, of the way his laughter made you feel unsteady, of the strange peace in his gaze, of the way the villagers feared not his sores but his smile, and you began to wonder, where does illness end, and fear begin? Is madness a sickness of the mind, or simply the body refusing to play its part? Even now, when you laugh too long or too loud, you sometimes glance over your shoulder, and you listen for the creak of a cage that no longer stands. The iron bar glowed red in the hearth, a narrow strip of fire forged into shape. It hissed against the stone when turned, the sizzle sharp and sudden, like breath drawn too fast in a quiet room. You sat against the far wall, knees to your chest, watching it heat. You had seen a fever before, but never one treated with flame. Outside, the wind howled through the trees. Winter pressed its body against the door, cold and relentless. But inside, the sweat clung to your temples. The boy lying on the table was barely conscious, his face mottled and slick, his lips cracked and darkened with blood. His name was Merrick. He had once helped you lift a broken barrel outside the tavern. He had smiled then. Now, he did not move. The healer, a woman with arms like butcher's hooks, and a voice that never wavered, stood above him, sleeves rolled, hair tied back. She did not offer comfort, only purpose. "It must be boiled out," she said. The others nodded. Boils covered Merrick's leg, swollen and black at their centers, edges purple like bruises from another world. His skin steamed. His chest rose with effort. His eyes, when they opened, did not recognize the room. The iron was ready. They didn't ask for prayers. There was no priest here, only fire and flesh. The healer dipped a cloth into vinegar, tied it between Merrick's teeth, and nodded to the boy's father. He held Merrick's shoulders. Another man gripped his ankles. The healer lifted the brand. You couldn't look away. The iron met skin with a scream, muffled, but raw, and a sound like meat frying. The smell filled the room at once, acrid and thick. A gasp escaped your throat. Tears came unbidden. You pressed your face into your hands, but the image had already seared into your mind. A second boil, a second press. This time, Merrick did not scream. You do not remember how long it lasted. Time seemed to stretch and buckle, folding around the heat. When it was over, the iron was returned to the fire, and Marek lay still, a charred map of pain etched into his thigh. The healer wiped her hands on her apron. "Now, we wait," she said. No one spoke. Cauterization, they called it. A word you only half understood, but everyone believed in it. Fire drove out rot. Heat stopped spread. Better to burn one part than lose the whole. You had heard stories of soldiers cauterizing sword wounds in the field, of shepherds burning boils with oil-soaked rags and hot stones, of mothers pressing copper coins to festering flesh. The pain, they said, is the problem. In the corner the fire dimmed. Marek lived. Barely. He would never walk without a limp, never work with both hands again. But he survived. That was enough. And yet, in the nights that followed, you dreamed of heat, of the iron, of flesh peeling back like fruit rinds. You imagined the healer's hands, steady, merciless. You wondered what else she had burned. Who else? One morning, a girl from the next village came with pox across her chest. The healer refused to cut. "Too far gone," she muttered. But the girl's mother begged. She offered her own hand, if it would help. The healer relented. This time it was oil, boiled with nettle and garlic, poured directly onto the sores. The girl shrieked and flailed. The walls trembled with the sound. She was 9. You stood outside and listened. The fever broke days later. The girl lost patches of skin, but lived. The healer was praised. Bread and coin left at her door, but you noticed how she flinched when thanked, how she scrubbed her hands too hard in the stream, how her eyes didn't meet yours. One evening, you asked her if she was afraid. She glanced up, surprised. "Afraid of what?" "The pain," you said. She paused. "Not theirs," she replied, "but of what comes if I don't cause it." That stayed with you. Later, when your brother fell ill, the choice came to your family. Fever, no sores but trembling. The healer came, examined, and gave no verdict. "Your choice," she said. "We can wait. Or we can burn." Your father chose to wait. The fever passed. No flame was needed. But every moment of that wait, you wondered, would it rise again? Would the cost be higher next time? You understood then why fire was trusted. It gave an illusion of control, of action, a way to fight the invisible with something tangible, sharp, immediate, even if it scarred, even if it failed. You visited Marek once more before leaving the village for good. He stood in the doorway of the mill, a cane in one hand, his legs stiff beneath layers of cloth. He smiled, not bitterly, but not warmly either. "I still feel it sometimes," he said. "When it rains." You nodded. "I'd rather limp," he added, "than rot." The wind carried the scent of smoke from a hearth down the road. You didn't know whether it was cooking or curing. The moon was red the night before you fell ill. Not pink, not orange, but a deep, swollen crimson, like blood held too long beneath the skin. It hung low over the village fields, staining the frost-laced wheat in the colour of omen. The cows refused to lie down. The dogs howled long into the dark. Even your grandmother, who laughed at spirits and shrugged at superstition, lit an extra candle that night and whispered to it as if it could whisper back. They said Mars was burning close too, closer than in decades. "The red star rides," murmured the midwife, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "And blood will rise in its wake." You didn't understand. Not until the cough came. At first it was a tickle in your throat. Dry, harmless. Then came the heat, the dizziness, the sound of your own breath, wheezing through the dark like wind through a crack in the wall. Your mother brought water, cool cloths, whispered prayers in rhythm with your pulse, but nothing changed. Then she summoned the astrologer. He arrived in the early light, hunched and wide-eyed, a man made more of parchment than flesh. His hands were ink-stained. His teeth were missing. Around his neck hung a globe, not of the earth, but of the heavens. Silver rings inscribed with symbols you could not name. He did not greet you, did not ask for symptoms. Instead he pulled out a vellum chart, spread it across the floor, and asked for the hour of your birth. Your mother told him. He began to draw. The stars, he explained, held the secrets of your flesh. Their positions at your first breath shaped your blood, your temperament, the strengths and weaknesses of your inner self. Saturn ruled your bones, Mercury your lungs, Mars your temper and fevers, Venus your skin, the moon your humors, when they misaligned, when one wandered too close or pulled too far, the body followed. Your chart, he said, was distressed. Jupiter had turned its back, Mars loomed, the moon waned in a house of sorrow, and the sun, the vital flame, had disappeared behind the veil of Pisces. No wonder, he muttered. No wonder the fever found you. You wanted medicine, a tonic, something to hold. But the astrologer offered only ritual. You were to wear copper on your left wrist, to balance Mars. You were to avoid figs, fish, and sour milk for the next lunar cycle. You were to lie with your head facing west, always west, where the sun dies, so it might pull the fever with it. And most important, you were not to look at the moon again until it turned white. Your mother obeyed. She turned your bed, boiled copper rings until they shone, smashed your sister's favorite pitcher to avoid serving milk. When you grew worse, the astrologer returned, more urgent now. He burned fennel and chamomile in a brass bowl, etched with constellations. He spoke to the air, but you only coughed. You learnt this belief was older than belief itself, that long before healers and surgeons, people watched the sky to understand the body. A farmer would not plant unless Venus smiled. A birth was halted if Mercury retrograded. A child's future health could be read in the slant of the rising moon. To suffer was not to be cursed. It was to be out of sync, and so they tried to resync you. One night your fever broke. Not with ritual, not with chanting. It simply passed, as weather does. The astrologer claimed it was the position of the stars, that Venus had softened, that Mars had blinked. He drew a new chart and said you would recover, though you must avoid conflict for the next fortnight. You believed him, because you wanted to. But in the quiet days that followed, you began to notice strange things. A woman who refused to eat before sunrise. A man who wore a crescent moon sewn into his cap for the lungs. A boy who kept his back to the east at all times. The village, you realized, was a web of tiny orbits. Lives tethered not to reason but to rhythm, to sky. You watched them from your window, still weak. And one evening, you turned your gaze to the heavens. The stars pulsed, steady and cold. They did not comfort you. They did not curse you. They simply were. And you wondered, were they ever watching? Or were we only ever watching them? The wind changed direction that morning. It swept in from the east, sharp, dry, and sour, stirring ash from the hearth, and lifting skirts at doorways. The old men on the green sniffed it, and fell silent. Your mother closed the shutters without a word. The baker's wife hung vinegar-soaked cloth above her door. Even the dogs lowered their heads and crept beneath carts. Something had returned, and this time it came on the wind. By midday, a horse lay dead in the field, its eyes open and mouth foamed. The stable boy who found it was coughing by dusk, and by morning the cough had spread to the weaver's son, then to the priest's niece, then to the boy who sold eggs in the square. No one spoke aloud of plague. Not yet, but the fear had already arrived. They said it was the east wind, always the east wind. It brought more than weather, it brought punishment. In your grandmother's day, a similar gust had preceded the black boils. Before that, a drought. Before that, madness. The devil rides the east, she said, tracing a circle around the hearth with chalk. He wears the wind like a cloak. Some villagers believed it literally. They tied bells to their windows and placed bowls of salt beneath beds to confuse the wind. Others muttered that it wasn't wind at all, but breath, the collective exhale of a world too weary to hold its rock. Still the sickness spread. You began to count the coughs in the night. 2 from the house next door, 1 from the blacksmith's boy, 4 from the inn. The sounds carried, low and raw, riding the wind like seeds cast from a hand unseen. In the square, someone hung a cat from the gallows tree. To stop the witches, they said. Another house burned, a family accused of consorting with outlanders. A midwife whipped for saying the wind was only air. And you stopped breathing deep. You stuffed your sleeves with herbs. You whispered prayers into your coat, afraid your very exhale might carry death. One morning, the wind ceased, just stopped, like a candle snuffed. But no one cheered. The silence felt heavier, as if something had settled. The priest finally named it. Plague, he said from the pulpit, his voice brittle. Repent. The air has turned. What followed was not prayer but panic. Doors were shuttered, trades halted, bread went unbaked, fields unploughed. Families did not bury their dead. They burned them. You watched from your window as a cart passed, piled high and quiet. The driver wore gloves soaked in vinegar, a mask of linen across his face. He did not meet your eyes. The village healer tried to intervene, offered infusions, fumigations, wax-sealed salves, but none of it stopped the wind. None of it stopped the cough. Then the finger-pointing began. Some blamed the butcher. He had travelled last month. Others blamed the peddler from the coast, or the girl who read stars in her tea leaves, or the old widow with a black dog and too many candles. Accusations turned to beatings. One night, a man was drowned in the river, just to be sure. You did not leave the house. You watched, listened, waited. The air grew heavy, then still. The wind did not return. But the sickness stayed. That was when you understood the wind had not brought the plague. The fear had... When your sister fell ill, your mother said nothing. She soaked rags in vinegar. She tied rosemary around the bedposts. She locked the door and closed the shutters, but the cough came anyway. And in that silence, you began to wonder, what if the devil was not in the wind? What if he was in the way we breathed each other? In the blame? In the panic? In the eyes that narrowed? The fists that clenched? The voices that whispered? It's them, not us. Them. One night, you lit a candle and cracked the window. The wind touched your face, warm, soft, almost sweet. And you wept, not for fear, but for all that had been lost in its name. The scriptorium was cold that morning, its stone walls sweating in the early light, its windows fogged from breath and time. You entered quietly, your steps muffled by old rushes strewn across the floor. The monk who greeted you was ancient, with hands like parchment and eyes that flickered like candle flame. Dim but never unwatchful, he gestured to the desk without a word. You sat, heart uneasy. Laid before you were the letters, dozens, maybe hundreds, each scrawled in different hands, different inks, on scraps of parchment, linen, birch bark, whatever could hold a final word. They came from cities now quiet, towns reduced to ash and silence, from mothers and fathers, children, monks, soldiers, lovers, all of them sick, all of them dying, all of them writing. The monk dipped his quill, cleared his throat, and began to read. Dearest Helena, he said softly, the cough grows worse. I cannot keep food down. They say it is the plague. I have tied rosemary to the windows and prayed until my lips bled, but God is silent. He paused, took a breath. I do not fear death, only that I will be forgotten. Another letter, this one from a child, the handwriting uneven and smudged. Papa, please come. Mama is cold, and I am scared. The man with the mask came and said not to go outside, but it is lonely here. The candle went out, then another. This one burned around the edges, the ink washed by tears or water. To anyone who finds this, bury me, I beg you, not with the pigs. As once a wife, a singer, I wore blue in the spring. Please remember that. You sat, unmoving, as the monk read. His voice never wavered, never rose, just one word after the next, like stones dropped into a bottomless well. You learnt that the letters came from all over, carried by messengers who never returned, sent by families desperate for connection, for dignity, for the last ember of recognition. Some were never opened until now. Some had waited decades, unread. Some had been sealed with wax in the shape of a heart. Others had only smudges where names once were. And every one of them held the same echo. See me. Not cure me. Not save me. Just see me. The monk handed you one. It was addressed simply, to the living. You unfolded it carefully. They say we are cursed. It read, they cover their faces and run when we walk by. We are not yet dead, but already ghosts. I do not want your prayers. I want your memory. Promise me you'll tell someone I laughed once, that I danced at midsummer, that I cried when my daughter was born. I was a person, not a plague. You could not finish reading. Tears fell, not from the pain of their deaths, but from the clarity of their voices. There was no bitterness, no rage, only a quiet desperation to not be lost to the void, to remain in someone's story, even a stranger's. The monk closed the last letter and looked at you. "We keep them," he said, "so they are not erased." You asked him how long he had been doing this. He smiled faintly. "Since the last fever." You asked if it helped. He placed a hand gently on the pile. "The world forgets too quickly," he whispered. "But these remember." As you stood to leave, he pressed one letter into your hand. Blank, unwritten. "For when your time comes," he said. That night, you stared at the parchment. Your fever had not returned. Your body was well, but the silence inside you felt heavier. You thought of Helena, of the child alone in the dark, of the singer buried nameless, and you began to write. Not because you were dying, but because you were still alive. It began with the incense. At first a simple ritual, one bowl at the doorway, lit each morning with sprigs of juniper and a shaving of bark. Your grandmother did it before sunrise, her hand steady, her face turned toward the east. For cleansing, she said. For watching, you didn't understand. Not then. You were still young enough to believe in the safety of walls. But the fever was in the village again, and with it came the smoke. Each home, each stall, each chapel burned its own blend. Rosemary for the throat, sage for the lungs, laurel for the soul. The air became thick, scented, heavy. It wrapped around you as you walked, clung to your hair, soaked into your clothes. You could taste it with every breath. But the smoke was not just protection. It was a sign. You began to hear it whispered between neighbors. How the smoke curled, how it moved. If it rose straight and clean, the illness would pass. If it circled leftward, the house was already marked. If it scattered, the spirit had not yet chosen. But if it died suddenly, without wind or breath, then someone inside was already lost. You watched your mother light her bowl with care. She always stood still after placing the herbs, waiting for the first plume. You could see it in her eyes. The fear, the hope. Would it dance or fall? Would it drift or die? That morning, the smoke curled sharply left. She didn't speak. You remembered the stories. Old ones, told by firelight. How smoke was once the language of the gods. How it carried words, not written but felt. How the sick used to burn their wishes, their apologies, their memories, and send them skyward. How the gods chose who lived based on the scent. You thought it was superstition, until the smoke curled toward you. The next day, your sister coughed. Not a loud cough. Quiet. Buried. But your mother heard it. She set out bowls in every room. She burned garlic skins and dried plum wood. She tied silver bells to the window latches, and still the smoke turned inward. The healer was summoned. She brought charcoal, crushed with ash and thistle. Her smoke was darker, thicker. She called it smoke that watches. She claimed it could reveal not only illness, but presence, the breath of what dwelled unseen. You sat in the corner as she worked. She lit her blend, muttered words older than language, and watched. The smoke rose, paused, then curled tightly to the right and fell flat to the floor. The healer gasped. Your mother cried out. Your sister turned away. She's not alone, the healer said. You asked what that meant, but no one answered. After that, the smoke became your obsession. You woke early to watch it. You memorized its paths. You counted its spirals, traced its trails with your eyes. You came to believe it was speaking in curls and collapses, in pulses and fades. You saw it drift around your father's boots but avoid your brother's bed. You saw it split in two when the old priest walked past. You began to light your own bowls, in secret, with herbs stolen from the cupboard. You burned hair and salt, sage and soot. You watched. You waited. You breathed it in, even when it stung. Then, one night, you saw it. Not just smoke, but something inside it. A shape, a flicker, a face, maybe, gone too fast to be sure. You said nothing. The next day your sister's fever broke. She lived. The bowl at her bedside, long forgotten, still burned. The smoke curled straight and high, unwavering. The village rejoiced. They praised the healer, the herbs, the prayer. But you knew. You had seen the way the smoke had paused, turned, shifted, not away from her, but toward you. You have not lit a bowl since. And yet, even now, Years later, when you walk past a fire and see the smoke lift, you cannot help but stop and wonder what it sees. The road was long and dusted with silence. Pebbles crunched beneath your soles, dry grass rustled like whispers from the earth. And ahead of you, the pilgrim walked, a woman of indeterminate age, wrapped in layers of linen and wool, a woven satchel slung over one shoulder, and a child asleep on her back. She did not speak often, but when she did, it was with the weight of someone who had worn grief like a second skin. You had joined her not out of faith, but out of desperation. The sickness had come to your house again, not with violence, but with stillness. You woke to find your hands trembling, your breath too shallow. The inside of your skin felt wrong. The healer had offered tinctures, the priest had whispered prayers, but it was the pilgrim, passing through the village on her way to the holy spring, who looked at you and said, "You still have time." So you followed her. The spring was 2 days' walk through dense hills and stony ridges, a place known in story but rarely in truth. It was said to be fed by the tears of a long-dead saint, a girl who had wept for the sick until her heart stopped. Where her body was laid, a stream burst forth, and to this day the water healed, if not the flesh, then something deeper. You didn't believe it, but you believed in walking. The pilgrim told stories as she walked, some for you, some for the child, some for no one at all. She spoke of towns where dreams were weighed on brass scales, where people wore masks not for illness, but for memory. She spoke of a king who drank from a well until he forgot his own name, and of a girl who swallowed salt every morning so that her body would remain inhospitable to ghosts. You did not ask if they were true, you only listened. By the second evening, the fever was stronger. You stumbled as you walked, your tongue thickened in your mouth. The sky turned darker than it should have, as if mourning something not yet gone. The child on her back cried once, a thin, sharp wail, and then fell silent again. She did not stop walking. When you reached the spring, it was nearly midnight. It lay in a hollow of stone surrounded by moss and moonlight. The water no wider than a grave, no deeper than a prayer. The air smelled faintly of iron and mint. Fireflies floated above the surface like sparks waiting to catch. She knelt beside it, unwrapped the child, and dipped her hands into the water. "Not to drink," she said. "To remember." You copied her. The water was cold enough to steal your breath. She cupped some in her palms, poured it over your forehead, then whispered a name you didn't recognize. "She'll hear you now," she said. You didn't ask who. You lay beside the spring that night, your skin damp with sacred chill, your head on a bundle of nettle and wool. The fever pulsed behind your eyes like a distant drum. But the stars above were impossibly still, and the child, curled in her mother's arms, reached out and touched your hand. That was all. No revelation, no miracle, just a quiet sleep. And in that sleep, you dreamed of still water and warm breath, of hands holding yours in the dark, of a voice, maybe hers, maybe yours, humming a tune, older than words. When you woke, the fever had lessened. You sat up slowly, every joint aching, your breath ragged but deeper. The pilgrim was already preparing to leave. She offered you a piece of bread and a strip of dried plum, nothing else. You asked her why the spring worked. She shook her head. "It doesn't always, but believing it might, sometimes does." You returned to your village days later. No one asked where you'd gone. No one noticed you'd returned thinner, quieter. Your mother kissed your brow and said, "The worst has passed." The healer nodded, as if it had been her doing. The priest offered a quiet psalm, but only you remembered the spring. Only you remembered the feel of that water on your skin. And sometimes when the air grows heavy and sickness whispers at the edges of the world again, you find yourself humming the tune from your dream. And you remember, sometimes belief itself is the medicine. The gates creaked open on polished iron hinges, revealing a garden unlike any you had ever seen. It was neither lush nor fragrant. There were no roses, no herbs, no singing birds. The hedges were trimmed into stiff, unnatural shapes. The trees bore no fruit, and the fountains, carved from black stone, flowed not with water, but with vinegar. You stepped cautiously, the gravel beneath your boots crackling like bones under frost. A servant in a pale blue livery led you down a narrow path. "He calls it his garden of healing," she said, barely above a whisper, but I don't know what it heals. At the end of the path stood a man, tall, pale, with hands hidden behind his back. He wore a coat of fine velvet, and a smile that did not reach his eyes. He was the master of this estate, a nobleman known across the region not for his generosity or his rule, but for his obsession with illness. He had never been sick, he claimed. Not a cough, not a fever, not a single tremble of the hand or pang of the gut, and he intended to keep it that way. You had come because your cousin had been taken into his service months ago, and no word had returned. Your uncle had begged you to inquire. She's clever, he'd said. Too clever to waste in a place like this. Now, walking past marble statues wrapped in gauze and glass jars pulsing with murky fluids, you wondered if cleverness was what had drawn her here. The nobleman welcomed you with a nod. You're here for the demonstration, he said. Good. Not many take an interest in preventative medicine. You followed him into a courtyard, where a shallow stone basin sat beneath a canopy of netted silk. Within it, dozens of leeches swam in tight spirals, their bodies black and slick as river stones. A boy sat beside the basin, his arms submerged to the elbow, face pale and still. The nobleman gestured. A monthly purge, he said, to rid the blood of mischief before it begins. They drain only what is excessive. I monitor it carefully. You looked to the boy. You didn't speak. A physician approached, bowing low. Would you like the tonic prepared? The nobleman nodded. Yes, the tincture of pearl dust and charcoal, and prepare a garlic poultice for the feet. He turned back to you. The body is like a garden, he explained. It must be weeded before the rot begins. Leeches are the gardener's hand, tinctures the rain. I bathe only in vinegar. I breathe only through silk. You asked about your cousin. He blinked. Which one was she? You gave her name. His brow furrowed. Ah, the one with the skeptical eyes. He led you to a small room near the back of the garden. Inside, your cousin sat on a cushioned bench, folding linen with slow, careful hands. She looked up and smiled faintly, not in recognition, but in resignation. I'm fine, she said. Truly. You asked if she wanted to leave. She hesitated. There is safety here, she said. Cleanliness, predictability, but no life, no sound of laughter, no dirt beneath the nails, just vinegar and bloodletting, and raw. You returned to the garden with her beside you. The nobleman stood near a wall of cabinets, each filled with dried plants, crushed minerals, shards of amber, horn, coral. He did not turn as you passed. Stay as long as you like, he said. Illness is always watching, but so am I. You left that evening. Your cousin did not follow. Weeks later, a letter came. Her handwriting was different. Tight, precise, almost unfamiliar. I'm still well, she wrote, but I no longer feel real. The village healer read the letter and scoffed. A man like that believes he can outwit death, she said. But the cost is too high. Even kings must rot. You folded the letter, tucked it into your coat, and lit a candle by the window. You could still see the garden in your dreams, the leeches spiraling like ink in water, the silence thicker than the air, the fountains that never quenched thirst. And you wondered, is a body untouched by illness truly whole, if its spirit is starved? Even kings, after all, cannot leach the fear from their bones. The village was quiet. Not with fear, but with reverence. It sat nestled in the fold of two hills, wrapped in fog most mornings, and bathed in the scent of earth and rain. The homes were small and low, with moss growing between their stones and prayer flags fluttering like weary sighs in the wind. You arrived just after dusk, when the light was soft and the shadows had begun to stretch like old hands reaching across the road. They greeted you not with words but with silence. A gentle nod, a hand to the heart. You were not the first to come, nor would you be the last. You were sick. Not visibly, not dangerously, but deep. A lingering ache in your joints, a tightness in your chest that no poultice could ease, the kind of illness that lingers in the folds of thought. Not yet death, but not quite life. You had heard of this place. Not from a healer, nor a priest, but from a traveller who passed your village with a pack full of glass beads and stories. He said there was a valley where people remembered the names of the sick aloud, where healing came not through bloodletting or herbs, but through salt, ash and wind. You did not believe him, but you had nothing else to try. The ritual began at moonrise. The woman who led it was ancient, her hair white as frost, her voice like a broom sweeping slowly across a stone floor. She led you to the center of the village where a wide circle had been carved into the earth. At its edge sat bowls, dozens, maybe more, each filled with salt, each paired with a slender strip of ash-streaked parchment. One by one, villagers approached the circle. They knelt. They wrote a name, not their own. Not always someone living. Sometimes a child long gone. Sometimes a husband lost in the last fever. Sometimes a name they no longer remembered the face for, only the age. They folded the paper gently, dipped it into the salt, and whispered aloud. "This was my mother," one said. "She taught me to tie bundles of time when I was 6. This was my brother," said another. He laughed like spring water, even at the end. You stood there, listening. The air grew heavy, not with sorrow, but with remembrance. A different kind of weight. When it was your turn, your hands trembled. You picked up the parchment, the charcoal smudged easily. You thought of your sister, of the dream you'd had where she called your name across a river you couldn't cross. You wrote it. And then, without meaning to, you wrote more. You wrote your mother's lullaby, the way your father's hand felt on your fevered brow, the dog that waited 3 days by your sickbed when you were 8, the neighbor who brought you honey when your cough was too strong to speak. You folded the paper. You placed it in the salt. The woman came beside you. She lit a small flame, held it to the edge of the bowl. The parchment caught, curled, and turned to ash. The smoke rose. No one clapped. No one spoke. But you felt something inside you shift. Later she gave you a pouch of ash and salt to carry home. "When you feel it return," she said, "scatter this into the wind." And you asked her what it did. She looked at you with eyes so old they seemed made of stone. It remembers you. That night, you slept in a room no larger than a cart, wrapped in wool and the scent of herbs you could not name. You dreamed not of sickness, but of voices, dozens, hundreds, murmuring names into the sky. In the morning, the ache in your chest remained, but it no longer frightened you. You left quietly. No goodbyes, only another hand to the heart, another nod. Back in your village, when the tightness returned weeks later, you stood on the hill at sunset. You held the pouch. You whispered 3 names, and let the ash go. He arrived on the 3rd day of rain, riding a horse so clean it looked painted. His coat was dark and simple, his shoes polished, his hands gloved not in wool but in something thin, pale, and strange. Soft leather, like skin made into a second skin. He carried no satchel of bones, no pouches of dried herbs, no bells to ward off spirits, just a small black case, square and sharp at the corners. When he dismounted, he did not look to the sky or cross himself at the chapel door. He simply stepped over the muddy threshold and asked, "Where are the sick?" You stood nearby, hidden behind a wall of firewood, watching, listening. The villagers did not answer. They stared. He removed his gloves. Slowly, carefully, as if the act itself was sacred. Then he reached into his case and pulled out glass, vials, tiny tubes, tools with silver tips, instruments that shimmered in the low light like rain on metal. The healer stepped forward, her face hard. "We've already burned wormwood, hung salt, offered milk at the crossroads. This isn't a place for new ideas." He didn't flinch. "I've come to see what the sickness does, not what we believe it does." A silence bloomed, not hostile, just unsure. He was offered a stool in the square, but he refused it. Instead, he walked from door to door, asking to wash his hands before entering each home. No one had seen this before. The act confused them. "Why wash before touching the ill?" He answered simply, "Because what harms them may cling to me." The midwife laughed. "You think filth is the cause?" He nodded. "Not filth. Something in it. Small, invisible, but not imaginary." The word invisible hung in the air like incense smoke, weightless, impossible to grasp. He spent his days among the sick, listening, observing. He measured pulses with a silver coil, peered into mouths with polished mirrors, and wiped down every surface he touched. He boiled his linens in vinegar and fire. He burned old straw beds. He refused to allow anyone to reuse a cloth once soiled. The villagers whispered. He had no charms, no prayers, no smoke, only questions. One evening, You crept into the barn where he worked. He didn't chase you away. He offered you a stool, a piece of bread, a clean cloth for your hands. Then he showed you a small circle of glass and told you to hold it to the light. You saw nothing. He said, "There are things in the world too small to see, but not too small to kill. I believe the sickness spreads through touch, through air, through water that stands too long, not through sin, not through stars, through us." You didn't understand, but you listened. In the following days, something began to shift. The coughing in the southern row grew quieter. The dying slowed. The smoke in the alleys thinned. And always, he walked, calm, quiet, wiping his hands, boiling his cloths, never praying, never promising. The priest called him faithless. The healer called him dangerous. But fewer people were dying. One woman said, "He doesn't comfort me, but he doesn't lie." Another said, "He doesn't bless, but he does clean." You found yourself watching him more closely. His silence was not cold, it was focused. His hands never shook. His eyes never narrowed. He did not seek praise or fear. He only wanted understanding. When the sickness finally passed, as all plagues eventually do, the village tried to thank him. They offered coin, bread, a scarf woven from blue wool. He refused. "I didn't save you," he said. "You saved each other when you stopped touching, when you stopped hiding, when you stopped pretending the sickness came from God." Then he left, quietly. No fanfare, no story, but his tools remained. The glass, the boiling, the washing of hands. Years later, when the next fever came, people remembered. They boiled water, burned straw, opened windows. They did not hang charms. They scrubbed. And when children asked why, mothers said, "Because once a doctor came, and he didn't believe in magic, but he believed in something smaller, something real." You kept his glass. You still hold it to the light, and though you see nothing, you believe. The sickness returned, but no one spoke of it. The village, once loud with gossip and grief, folded in on itself like parchment scorched at the edges. There were no bells, no processions, no mourning veils drawn across doorways, just silence, dense and suffocating, like wool soaked in cold water. You walked the streets and heard only the caw of distant crows, the creak of shuttered windows, and the occasional rustle of skirts as neighbors passed each other without nods, without words. It began with a cough, not yours, but your neighbor's. A dry, shallow thing, barely louder than the wind. She stopped coming to market. Her daughter stopped fetching water. Then one morning, their door was bolted from the outside, and no one asked why. At first you thought it was caution, a quiet respect for illness, as if stillness could soften its touch. But then more doors closed, more faces vanished, and still no one spoke. Even the priest, whose sermons had once thundered from the chapel walls, now mumbled his liturgy with eyes downcast, voice barely audible above the sputter of the altar flame. The healer, too, grew quiet. No more cries for boiling pots, no more urgent footsteps in the night. She came and went like a ghost, leaving herbs on thresholds without knocking. You tried once to name it. You stood in your doorway and said the word plague. A child nearby burst into tears. Her mother turned, face pale as linen, and whispered, "Don't say it. You'll call it closer." And that was the truth of it. The sickness was not only feared, it was believed to be listening. To name it was to summon it. To describe it was to give it shape, and shape gave it power. So instead, people spoke in riddles. "He's taken to bed," they'd say. "She's gone quiet. The air is heavy in that house." You understood, and yet, something inside you rebelled. You wanted to speak plainly, to mourn openly, to call death by its name, so it could be faced rather than fled. But silence was the rule now. A strange, sacred protection. Even when your aunt passed, your uncle only nodded at her empty chair. Her name was not said again. One night, you wandered the village. The sky above was moonless, the kind of dark that presses against your eyes. From every window the same dim flicker. Candles burned low, curtains stayed drawn. It felt as though the world had been paused mid-sentence. You found the healer in the orchard, sitting beneath a tree that no longer bore fruit. She looked up, startled, as if she'd forgotten her own name. You asked her how many had died. She shook her head. I don't count anymore. You asked her why? Because counting leads to speaking, she said. And speaking leads to stories. And stories bring memory. We can't afford memory right now. She offered you a sprig of mint. For the chest, she said. But take it quietly. You returned home, laid the mint on your pillow, and listened. In the distance, an old man sang softly to himself, a tune without words. The next morning he was gone. The silence was not without comfort. There was a strange peace in it. No arguments, no blame, only the gentle rituals of survival, the sweeping of thresholds, the boiling of water, the tightening of shawls. People moved slowly, as if sound itself might shatter their world. But you could feel it building, the need to speak, the pressure of unsaid names behind every tongue. Children whispered into their blankets. Lovers mouthed apologies into cupped hands. Grandmothers hummed lullabies without breath. One evening you lit a candle and sat beside your brother's bed. He had begun coughing 2 nights before. He said nothing. You said nothing. The only sound was the scratch of the flame against the silence. Then he turned to you and whispered, "Tell me something real." You didn't know what to say. So you said his name, once, quietly, and the room did not shatter. The sky did not fall. The sickness did not flee, but it did not worsen. He slept. You sat there, awake, through the dark, and when dawn came, you heard another voice. From the house across the lane, a prayer, the first in days, not loud, but real, and you realized then that the silence had not protected you. It had only hidden the hurt, buried it beneath unspoken grief. You stepped outside. The sky was grey, but the air, it felt lighter. And when you passed the neighbour's house, you nodded and said, "Good morning." The window shutter twitched, and someone whispered it back. She arrived without warning, wrapped in a wool cloak the colour of dried lavender, her boots caked in mud, and her hair braided into a rope that fell past her waist. She carried no bag, no charm, no staff, only a small wooden box, and a voice so gentle it seemed shaped by silence itself. No one summoned her. No one knew her name. She simply appeared, walking down the narrow village road as if she had always been coming. At first, no one approached her. Strangers were dangerous now, possible vessels of the sickness. The priest watched from his window, candle flickering behind his uneasy face. The healer kept to her cottage, arms folded, eyes narrowed, but the woman made no claims, gave no sermons. She simply went where the cough was heard loudest. She began with the weaver's wife. You saw her enter the cottage, sleeves rolled to the elbow, steam rising from a pot she carried in her hands. Inside, the woman lay feverish, mouth slack, eyes sunken. Others had passed her by, afraid to get too close, afraid to touch. But this new healer sat beside her, dipped a cloth into the steam, and wiped her brow with slow, deliberate care. She spoke softly, words only the sick woman could hear. No spells, no Latin, just warmth. She stayed there, through the night. By morning, the weaver's wife was still sick, but calmer. Her breathing had steadied. Her lips had colour again. The stranger left without asking for coin, and so it began. House after house, bed after bed, she entered them all. She cradled infants burning with fever, rubbed oil into the chests of coughing boys. She sang as she cleaned wounds, hummed as she wiped away sweat. Always close, always gentle. She was not afraid of skin, of breath, of the trembling touch of those others had long since abandoned. You watched her from afar. Then, one afternoon, you found her kneeling by your brother's side. He had fallen sick the day before, sudden, as they all were, and now she was here, holding his hand, as if it were the most fragile thing in the world. She dipped a cloth into warm wine, and pressed it to his neck. She combed his hair with her fingers. When he shivered, she wrapped herself around him like a blanket, not out of duty, but out of love. Your mother wept, not because your brother was worse, but because someone had touched him. The woman never gave her name. When asked, she simply said, "I'm here now." She wore no mask. No herbs hung around her neck. But she washed her hands obsessively, not with soap or charm, but with care. Her hands were cracked from it, skin raw from the endless cleansing. Some whispered that she must be mad. Others called her a saint. The healer scoffed. "It's sentiment," she muttered. It won't cure anything, but people kept surviving. Not all, never all, but enough. One evening you sat with her by a fire. She was wrapping a child's feet in wool soaked in vinegar. Her face was lined, older than you'd thought. She moved slowly, but with purpose. You asked her why she came. She looked up. Because when I was sick, no one would touch me. And that was the first time you saw her cry. She stayed until the sickness eased. Then, as quietly as she had arrived, she packed her small box and began to walk. No farewells, no ceremony, just a figure shrinking into the horizon, back toward wherever grief had first given her wings. But her presence remained. You saw it in the mother who now held her coughing child without fear, in the neighbor who offered her lap to a dying man's head. In your own hands, when you laid them on your brother's chest without trembling, touch became something sacred again, not a risk, a gift. And in that gift, healing returned. The earth opened slowly beneath the spade, not with resistance but with reluctant grace. Decades had passed since the fever, centuries, even. But the soil remembered. It held its stories close, folded in silence and stone. You stood at the edge of the trench, boots caked in loam, watching the archaeologists work in reverent quiet. Their tools were small, their hands precise. They did not dig as laborers, they uncovered as listeners. This was no battlefield, no temple, just an unmarked plot behind a crumbling chapel in a forgotten village. And yet, the dead were there, row upon row, shallow and hurried, their bones tangled like branches after a storm. Mass graves, they said. Plague burials. You stepped closer. The first skeleton they uncovered was curled, arms crossed tight to its chest, as if holding in a last breath. Beside it, a rusted rosary, the beads fused together by time and damp. Around the neck, a scrap of linen, still knotted, embroidered faintly with a child's initials. The archaeologist did not remove it. He only traced it with a gloved finger and whispered the letters aloud. Not to the team, to the bones. As the day wore on, more were revealed. A woman with coins over her eyes, once polished, now green. A man with a leech scar carved clean into his femur. A child with a small pouch still tied at the ankle, filled with crumbled rose petals and hair. Offerings, protections, stories. They catalogued each carefully. But you felt what they could not name, that these were not just remains. These were memories, not yours. Not the archaeologists, but the earth. You remembered then what the healer had once said, that the body stores every touch, every grief, and when the body is gone, the bones remember. One skeleton bore a hole in the skull. Deliberate, round, too perfect to be wound. Trepanning, they called it. A last-ditch cure for madness, or pressure, or unseen spirits. The archaeologist shook his head. They died trying to survive. You found a different kind of sorrow in that. Not tragedy, but devotion. Even the clay remembered their desperation, their hope, their faith in powders and prayers, in birds and blood. They had burned sage, swallowed emerald, carved toads into the lintels, and now all of it was dust. But still present. You asked to hold one of the bones. They gave you a fragment of rib light as wood. Smooth as shell, it held no pain, no magic, but your hands shook all the same. Because somewhere inside it, a name still whispered. That night, you walked among the open trenches under moonlight. The wind rustled the trees, and you imagined it carrying voices, not ghosts, but echoes. A mother calling her child back from the fever. A healer's chant. A priest's confession. A girl laughing one last time before the cough took hold. And you realized, we do not bury the past. We return it. The bones do not forget. They wait, they remind. In every scar, every charm, every crooked smile, locked in jawbone, a memory, a message. Not for the dead, for us. The hospital doors slid open without a sound, smooth as breath. Inside, everything glowed. Clean lines, white walls, pale lights that hummed like distant lullabies. You stepped into the antiseptic air and felt the present wrap around you like a glass dome. No incense. No herbs, just a quiet that was not spiritual, but engineered, precise, intentional. This was not the world of charms and toads. This was the age of understanding. And yet, something lingered. As you walked the corridors, shoes muffled by polished floors, The scent of disinfectant chasing every step, you noticed it. A nurse with a small silver coin sewn into the cuff of her sleeve. A doctor tapping the side of his clipboard twice before entering a room. A charm carved into the wood of a stethoscope. Not pronounced, not deliberate, just echoes. Echoes of older cures. A lullaby hummed to a crying child, in a melody once sung beside plague beds. A cup of rosemary tea offered, not as treatment, but as comfort. A mother whispering a prayer, under her breath, though her child now lay beneath machines instead of saints. You paused beside a wall of photographs, black and white faces, some smiling, some stern, early nurses, doctors, midwives with weather-worn skin. One held a bundle of herbs, another stood in front of a stone cottage, sleeves rolled, hands on hips. You realized they were healers too, before antibiotics, before microscopes, before the invisible was made visible. In a room down the hall, someone was dying. Not from plague, not from curse, but dying all the same. The nurse sat beside them, not moving, not speaking, just present, and in that moment you saw it clearly, that understanding has not erased belief. It has refined it, transformed it. The rituals are smaller now, quieter. They hum beneath the machines. They hide in gestures. The old medicine lives on, not in practice, but in instinct. You touched your chest, remembered the smoke that curled left instead of right. The salt and ash whispered into the wind, the healer who sang without promise. You passed a cart of supplies, gloves, gauze, a bottle labelled in perfect, sterile font, but tucked into the corner was a sachet, lavender, dried, forgotten, or placed with care. At the nurse's station, someone had drawn a tiny star in the corner of the whiteboard, just one, for luck, for protection, for memory. And you, too, carried it all. Not visibly, but in your fears, in your hopes, in the way you flinch at a sneeze, the way you search the stars when answers fail, the way you hold a child's hand through fever, whispering stories while the medicine works. Because healing has always been a story. We used to burn herbs, now we study cells, but the yearning to protect, to explain, to soothe, is the same. You walked out of the hospital and into the evening light. The city buzzed. The air held the faintest scent of rosemary from a passing food stall. A woman on the corner rubbed her charm and crossed herself. A boy coughed, and his father wrapped him tighter in his coat. We are still the same, still human, still trying, and maybe that is the cure we've been chasing all along. As the last breath of this forgotten world fades into silence, thank you for walking its winding path. If these stories stirred something old in your heart, subscribe, and return again when you need a voice to guide you through the shadows of the past. Now, tell me, which old belief do you still carry, even now? As the last echoes of these forgotten remedies fade, may they leave behind not fear but reverence, for how far we've come, and for the strange paths we took to get here. If this journey stirred something ancient in you, subscribe, and return whenever the night feels long. There are more stories waiting in the shadows of history. Which old remedy or belief surprised you the most? And do you think any still live in us today?